The night I met the family that would spend the next 9 years trying to erase me. My future mother-in-law looked me up and down and asked if I was there to fix the plumbing. I laughed, because I was certain she was joking. She was not. For almost a decade, that was exactly who I was to the Ashcrofts. The help, the mistake, the man their daughter would eventually come to her senses about. They called me a failure so gently, so politely, and so often, that after a while I began to believe them. But what none of them knew, what not one person seated at that long, cold dinner table could have imagined, is that the man they were quietly laughing at would one day become the only thing standing between their billion-dollar name and complete and total ruin. My name is Daniel, and this is the story of how the failure ended up holding the keys. Her name was Elena. She was the one Ashcroft who ever looked at me like I was a person, and not a problem her family would need to solve. We met in the returns line of a home goods store, of all the unromantic places on earth, and I had no idea that the name printed on the sign above our heads was hers. I fell in love with a woman who was returning a broken coffee maker. I did not fall in love with a fortune, but her family only ever saw the fortune, and they were certain that I saw it too. On our wedding day, I overheard Elena's older brother, Preston, making a bet with his friends, not about whether the marriage would last, about how many months it would take before I ran out of money and disappeared for good. He gave me 18. His mother, Margaret, gave me 12. And then there was Richard, Elena's father, the man who had built the Ashcroft Group from a single hardware store into an empire worth more than $1 billion. In 9 years, Richard Ashcroft said perhaps 40 words to me. He never once shook my hand. He never asked what I did, or what I hoped for, or what I was quietly building in the dark. To him, I was weather, something unpleasant that had drifted into his daughter's life and would, in time, pass. For years, I believed his silence was the coldest rejection of them all, a contempt so complete that it did not even require words. I was wrong about that silence. I was wrong in a way I would not begin to understand until a phone call in the dark from a dying man quietly rearranged everything I thought I knew. So how does a man they all called a failure end up seated at the head of the Ashcroft boardroom table, holding a pen that every single one of them is silently praying he will sign? How does the son-in-law they placed at the far end of the table, beside the kitchen door, become the one person alive who gets to decide whether their empire survives the night? I asked myself those very questions, sitting in that room, studying their faces. Margaret, pale as her own pearls. Preston, who looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Camille, Elena's younger sister, with one hand pressed over her mouth. And I will be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. A part of me had waited 9 years for that exact moment. A part of me had built an entire company just to reach it. From the outside, the Ashcrofts were flawless. That was their true gift, the thing they did better than anyone I have ever known. They could make the surface of a thing look perfect while it quietly came apart underneath. They did it to their company. They did it to their family. And for 9 long years, they did it to me. Every holiday card addressed to Elena and guest. Every dinner party where the conversation stopped the moment I stepped into the room. Every introduction. This is Elena's little project. This is Elena's charity case. This is the man Elena is somehow still married to. It was never loud. Loud cruelty you can point to. You can name it out loud. This was the other kind. The polite kind. The kind that arrives wrapped inside a compliment, so that the moment you object, you are the one who looks unwell. Through every bit of it, there was Elena, and I need you to understand her, because she is the reason I am alive to tell you any of this. While her family was busy measuring me against their money, Elena was quietly doing something not one of them ever noticed. She believed in me. Not with cash. Her own father kept her on the same small salary as any junior clerk, to build character, he liked to say. She believed in me with something far rarer than money. She would come home from that cold family office, find me hunched over a second-hand laptop at our little kitchen table, chasing an idea the whole world thought was foolish. And instead of laughing the way they laughed, she would pull a chair up beside me, rest her chin on my shoulder, and say the 4 words that saved me more times than I can count. Okay, walk me through it. I need you to hold on to one detail, because in the end, everything turns on it. The empire the Ashcrofts were so proud of had a single hidden weakness, one artery running through the very heart of it, and while they were busy measuring me against their fortune, that artery was quietly being cut. Not by a rival, not by the market, not by bad luck. It was being cut by one of their own. Somebody inside that beautiful gated house was making a long series of quiet, desperate choices, hiding enormous losses behind fresh flowers and confident smiles, borrowing again and again against a name that had taken 3 generations to build. And here is the most dangerous part of all. The person doing the cutting was the very one the entire family had decided could never do any wrong. The golden one, the heir. Before I take you back to the very beginning, I want to lay out the 3 questions that kept me awake for years, because for a long time I did not have the answers either, and I think you deserve to carry them with me. The first is the simplest, and the strangest of them all. How does a family with more than $1 billion, 3 generations of power, and an army of the finest lawyers money can buy, end up begging the one man they truly despise to save them? Empires like the Ashcrofts do not fall by accident. Something has to eat them from the inside, patiently, for years. And by the time I finally understood what was eating this one, it had already gone so far that even the family did not know how deep the rot ran. But one person did. One person had known for a very long time and had said absolutely nothing. The second question is the one that still keeps me up at night. What did Richard Ashcroft know that no one else in that family did? Because the old man, cold and silent as he was, saw something coming long before anyone else so much as suspected it. And in that silence, without telling his wife, without telling his golden son, without even telling his own daughter, Richard made a single quiet decision. A decision so complete that by the time the rest of the family discovered what he had done, there was nothing left on earth they could do to undo it. That one decision is the hinge this entire story turns on. It is the true reason I ended up at the head of that table. And when I finally learned exactly what he had done, and the reason he had done it, I had to pull my car to the side of the road, because I could no longer see through my own tears. And the third question is the hardest of all, because it is about me, and to this day I am not fully certain I gave the right answer. When I finally had every last one of them in the palm of my hand, when I could have burned it all to the ground and watched them lose everything, exactly the way they once bet that I would lose everything, why did I stop? Why did I hesitate at the very edge of it? Some of you, by the end of this, are going to think I was a fool, and some of you are going to understand it completely, in your bones, because you have been the person seated at the end of the table too. I want to know which one you are. But to judge me fairly, you have to start where I started, with nothing but an old toolbox my father left behind, and a note inside it carrying 4 words whose weight I would not understand for 30 years. Before we go any further, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story I am about to tell you is not the story the Ashcrofts would ever choose to tell. It is not the polished version printed in the business magazines with the flattering photographs and the carefully rehearsed quotes. It is the real one, the one that happened behind the tall iron gates and the fresh flowers in the lobby, in the rooms where the family only ever spoke freely once they were certain the failure could not hear them. And it begins, the way so many of these stories quietly do, not with money at all, but with a woman, a broken coffee maker, and a line at a returns counter that was about to change the course of both of our lives forever. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and for the first 18 years of my life, the low hum of those machines spinning was the closest thing I had to a lullaby. My mother cleaned office buildings at night and came home smelling of bleach and other people's coffee. My father left when I was 6. The only thing he left behind was an old metal toolbox and a note folded once and tucked beneath the wrench on top. And that note said 4 words, "Fix what you can." I was too young to understand it then. I understood it as an instruction to repair things, and so I became a boy who repaired things. Broken toasters, broken bicycles, broken radios I pulled out of the trash. It would take me 30 years, and a second father, to understand what those 4 words truly meant. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think people get this part wrong. I was never a genius. I was not some hidden prodigy waiting for the world to notice me. I was simply relentless. I read every business book the public library owned, some of them twice. I fixed people's laptops for $20. I flipped broken furniture I found sitting on the curb. And I failed. I failed at 3 separate businesses before I turned 25. And each time the ground came up a little harder. And each time it took me a little longer to stand. But I always stood. A phone repair kiosk that lasted 7 months. A 2-man moving company that a client's antique piano destroyed on a single flight of stairs. and a third one I still do not like to speak about, because it taught me how to lose absolutely everything and still put my shoes on the next morning. What I did not understand back then, the thing the Ashcrofts would never understand about me, is that every one of those failures was quietly teaching me something that could not be bought. The phone kiosk taught me margins. The moving company taught me logistics, how a physical thing gets from one place to another without breaking, without being late, without bleeding money on every single mile. And the third business, the one I will not name, taught me the most valuable lesson of all, which is how to be knocked flat by the world and get up anyway. Because getting up is a decision and not a feeling. Rich men inherit money. I inherited a collection of scars that would one day turn out to be worth more than any inheritance. I just did not know it yet, and neither did the family that would spend 9 years reminding me I had nothing. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the least romantic place on earth, I met Elena. It was the returns line of a home goods store, and she was ahead of me, holding a coffee maker and a look of genuine betrayal, telling the clerk that the machine made coffee that tasted like an apology. The line was long. We started talking. I told her I could probably fix it. She let me try, right there on the counter, and I could not. And by the time I finally admitted defeat, I had made her laugh 4 separate times, and she had written her number on the back of the receipt and pressed it into my hand. I walked out of that store, certain I had just met the most extraordinary woman alive. I had no idea that the name on the sign above the door, the name on the coffee maker, the name on that very receipt, was Ashcroft. She did not tell me, not for almost 2 months, and I have come to understand why. For those first weeks, she let me believe she was an ordinary woman with an ordinary job. She let me pay for cheap dinners I could barely afford. She rode in my 15-year-old car and never once flinched at the warning light that had been glowing on the dashboard since the day I bought it. I fell in love with a woman I believed was exactly like me, and she allowed it, on purpose, because she had spent her entire life being loved for her last name, and just once, she wanted to be loved for nothing but herself. I understand that now. But at the time, when the truth finally arrived, it did not feel like tenderness. It felt like the floor opening up beneath me. I found out by accident. We were sitting on my thrift store couch, watching television, when a glossy commercial came on. A home goods chain, a distinguished-looking founder smiling into the camera, and Elena went very still beside me. As a joke, I said she looked a little like that man on the screen. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "That is my father." I stood up. I remember thinking about my apartment above the laundromat, about my dying car, about every cheap meal I had let this billionaire's daughter order to save me a few dollars, and I felt like a fool, like a project, like the charity case they would eventually name me. And out of pure fear, I said the thing I would regret. I told her she should go, that people like her and people like me do not work, that I already knew exactly what her family would see when they looked at me. And Elena, 26 years old, sitting on that terrible couch, looked at me and said something I have never once forgotten. She said, "You are right about my family. You are completely right. They will look at you and see only the things you do not have. But I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who have everything and are nothing, and you are the first person I have ever met who has nothing and is everything. So I am not going anywhere. The only question is whether you are brave enough to stay." I stayed, and everything that came after, the folding chair, the failure, the boardroom, all of it, flowed out of that single moment on a thrift store couch, when a woman with every reason on earth to walk away, instead chose a man who owned nothing but a toolbox and a dream. The first time Elena brought me to the Ashcroft estate, I wore the only suit I owned, and I had pressed it 3 separate times the night before. I had watched videos on the internet about how to properly hold a wine glass, because I was genuinely afraid of holding it wrong in front of these people. The gate alone was longer than the street I grew up on. The house was not a house so much as a statement carved in old stone, with hedges trimmed so sharply they looked afraid to grow the wrong way. The front door opened before we even reached it, and standing there was Margaret, Elena's mother. She looked at me the way you look at something the dog has tracked across a clean carpet, and she smiled a smile with no warmth anywhere inside it, and she said, "Oh, you are taller than I expected. From how Elena described you, I pictured someone smaller." I did not understand the insult until much later that night. She had not been talking about my height. "Let me introduce them to you properly, because you are going to spend a great deal of time with these people, and you will need to know exactly who is who when everything finally comes apart. Richard, the father, the founder, the man who turned a single hardware store into an empire. He did not dislike me. Disliking me would have required him to consider me at all, and he never did. Margaret, the mother, the one who carried the knife. Every cruel thing she ever said to me was folded so neatly inside a compliment that if you repeated it back, you sounded insane. Preston, the son, the heir, handed the title of vice president at 26 for the singular accomplishment of having been born. And Camille, the younger sister, who was never cruel to me. Exactly. She simply never once opened her mouth to defend me. And I would learn that silence can be its own kind of verdict. For 9 years, this was the shape of my life inside that family. A seat at the far end of the table, always the one nearest the kitchen door. Conversations that died the instant I entered a room. A nickname that followed me everywhere. Spoken with a smile, so I could never object without seeming fragile. The failure. That is what Preston called me when he believed I could not hear. And after enough years, I started to wonder whether he was simply telling the truth. Because here is the thing no one warns you about being told you are worthless by people with power. If they say it kindly enough, and often enough, and from a grand enough house, you begin to believe them. There were nights I lay awake beside Elena, staring at the ceiling, doing quiet math in the dark, wondering if she would one day wake up and finally see me, the way the rest of them did. But Elena never did. And while her family was busy measuring me against their fortune, she was quietly investing in me, not with money she did not have access to, but with belief. She would find me at that kitchen table, night after night, working on a small idea I could not let go of. It was a smarter way to route deliveries for the very kind of home goods retailers her family dominated. A way to combine half-empty trucks, cut the waste, and get the right product to the right door faster and cheaper than anyone else. I built the first crude version of it on nights and weekends, out of a one-bedroom apartment, while working a day job her family would have found humiliating. I called it Meridian Logistics. Not one Ashcroft knew it existed. Elena made certain of that. And when I asked her why we were keeping it a secret, she gave me an answer I have never forgotten. She said, because the day they finally find out, I want it to already be too big for them to ruin. I did not fully grasp, back then, how completely right she was. I did not understand that the small, unglamorous thing I was building in the dark was aimed, like a key, being slowly and carefully cut, at the one lock on the one door that had been slammed in my face over and over again. To me it was survival. It was pride. It was a way to feel like a man in a family that treated me like furniture. I did not yet see it as a weapon, but somewhere out there, on a night I would remember for the rest of my life, the Ashcrofts were about to hand me a reason to sharpen it. They did not know it yet. But the mistake that would cost them everything was only one Thanksgiving away. I want to walk you through that Thanksgiving the way it actually happened, moment by moment, because I have replayed it in my mind 10,000 times since, and I have come to believe something about it that I could not see while I was living it. They did not humiliate me by accident that night. There was an audience. There was a purpose. It had been arranged. The whole family was there, along with a few of Richard's business partners, men whose approval the Ashcrofts collected the way other people collect fine art. Elena squeezed my hand beneath the table as we sat down and whispered, "Just get through dessert, and then we will leave early." I nodded. I had gotten through 100 of these dinners before. I told myself I could get through one more. We did not make it to dessert. I remember the small things, the way you always seem to remember them right before something breaks. I remember Margaret seating me down by the kitchen door again. "So you can help the staff if they need anything, Daniel." A little joke that placed the son-in-law in the servant's chair and drew a soft, comfortable laugh from the whole table. I remember Preston arriving nearly 40 minutes late, already loose and bright-eyed from drinking somewhere else, kissing his mother on the cheek and never once looking in my direction. And I remember thinking, the way I always did, just be still, smile, do not give them the reaction they are fishing for. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that Preston had a private reason to be desperate that night, and there is nothing on this earth more dangerous than a frightened man who needs, more than he needs air, to feel superior to someone. That reason had a name: Riverside. It was a luxury development Preston had staked his entire reputation on, the project that was finally going to prove he was his father's son, and not merely his father's mistake. Instead, it had become a hole in the ground that swallowed money, cost overruns, permits that fell through, contractors walking off the site because their invoices went unpaid, and that very week, I would learn much later. A wave of loans on that project had come due. Loans Preston had no way to cover, and the walls of his carefully painted life had begun to close in. So when he stood up that night, tapping his fork against a crystal glass, and turned that bright, drowning smile toward the far end of the table where I sat, he was not looking at a man beneath him. He was looking for a witness who would watch him be a winner one more time, and I was the safest target in the room. At first the toast seemed almost harmless. He thanked his parents. He thanked the partners. And then he raised his glass toward me and called me the family dreamer. 9 years in, and still chasing that little delivery app, or whatever it was that month. The laughter that followed was not really laughter. It was permission. Permission to keep going. And Margaret, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, added sweetly that it was lovely, really, that every family needed someone to remind them how fortunate they were. I felt Elena go rigid beside me. I put my hand on her knee. Not here. Not now. But Preston was not finished, and the thing that had been closing in on him all week needed somewhere to go, and it found me. He set his glass down, looked directly at me, and said the sentence I have never been able to unhear. He said, "You will never be anything but a failure, Daniel, and everyone at this table knows it. My father knows it, my mother knows it, and one day, when Elena finally wakes up, even she will know it. You are a temporary problem, and temporary problems get solved." I wish I could tell you that I rose to my feet and delivered some perfect answer that put him in his place. I did not. I sat there. My face went hot. My ears rang. And in the silence that followed, I looked slowly around that beautiful table. At Richard, who said nothing. At Margaret, who was very nearly smiling. At Camille, who would not lift her eyes from her plate. And I understood, completely and all at once, that Preston had only said aloud what every single one of them already believed. And that was the loneliest moment of my entire life. And then something happened that changed the temperature of the whole room. A chair scraped sharply against the floor. Elena stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did something far more frightening than shouting. She stayed calm. She looked at her brother, and then at her father, and she said, "You want to talk about failure? Preston has not turned a profit on a single project Dad has handed him in 3 years. Riverside is bleeding money by the week. The Hargrove account walked out last quarter because of him, and the only reason this family still has the reputation it pretends to have is that Daniel quietly fixed a delivery contract Preston nearly destroyed last spring, for free, and not one of you even noticed it happened. You could have heard a pin land on that Persian rug, because every word of it was true. And in that silence, I watched something move across Richard Ashcroft's face that I had never once seen there in 9 years. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was fear. The old man looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I had met him, as though a thought he had been avoiding for a very long time had finally caught up with him at his own dinner table. Margaret recovered first, the way she always did. She laughed, a bright and brittle sound, and said, "Elena, darling, you are overtired. Let us not embarrass your husband any further." She said the word husband the way you might refer to a temporary job title. Elena did not sit back down. She looked at me, and she said a single word, "Coat." And we left. We drove home in silence for 20 long minutes, the wipers dragging back and forth across the windshield, the estate shrinking to nothing in the mirror behind us. And then Elena, staring straight ahead into the rain, said the thing that would reshape both of our lives. She said, "Daniel, I want you to stop keeping Meridian a secret. I want you to build it like you are building it to win. And when it is finally big enough, I want you to buy back every ounce of respect they never gave you, not with anger, with numbers they cannot argue with." I asked her the question I was most afraid of. I said, "And what if I fail? What if Preston is right about me?" And without looking away from the road ahead, she answered. She said, "Then we will fail together, in our own home, on our own terms. But you are not going to spend one more Thanksgiving letting these people decide who you are." And something in me that had been bent low for 9 years slowly began to straighten. That night, in that car, I made 2 promises. The first was to Elena, and it was a good and clean promise, that I would stop hiding, that I would build Meridian in the open, that I would pour everything I had into it. I kept that promise, and it saved us. But I made a second promise too, silently, to no one but myself, staring at my own reflection in the dark glass of the window. And I have to be honest with you, because I promised you honesty. It was not a good promise. It was not a healthy one. It was a promise about revenge. And I did not yet understand what a promise like that can do to a man who keeps it. For the next 2 years, I disappeared into Meridian. And I want to be clear about something, because this is not a fairy tale, and I refuse to tell it like one. Success did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like water wearing down stone. Slowly, unglamorously, one contract at a time. I made cold calls from a folding chair in an empty leased warehouse with a space heater glowing at my feet, my breath fogging in the cold, a whiteboard on the wall filling up with the word no. But I understood something the Ashcrofts never did. The home goods empire their entire fortune rested on had a weakness, and the weakness was delivery. Getting the right couch, the right shipment, the right pallet of tile to the right place, on time, without losing money, was the unglamorous artery running through their whole industry. And I had spent 9 years studying that artery from the outside, as the man they would never let inside. That first year almost killed the whole thing 3 separate times, and I will tell you about the worst of the 3, because the people who tell these stories always skip the part where you are on your knees, and the part where you are on your knees is the only honest part. 8 months in, our single largest client, the one account keeping the lights on and the payroll met, called to say they were leaving for a competitor who had undercut us by a few cents a mile. Losing them meant I could not pay my people, and I had 11 of them by then. 11 human beings who had bet their careers on a man from above a laundromat. I sat in my car in the parking lot that night, running the same numbers over and over, and I heard Preston's voice in my head. Temporary problems get solved. And I wondered, for the first time, if maybe he had been right. I went home that night ready to tell Elena it was finished. Before I could get a single word out, she handed me a legal pad. On it, in her careful handwriting, she had sketched an entirely different way to route our trucks, consolidating half-empty loads from different clients onto shared runs, splitting the cost, filling the empty space that was quietly draining us dry. It was brilliant. It was, in fact, the exact idea that would one day make Meridian impossible to beat on price. She had been thinking about my company, on her own time, after her own long day, because she believed in it more than I did that night. I asked her how she could possibly know it would work, and she said, "I do not know, but I know you, and I would rather bet on you failing than on anyone else in the world succeeding." I kept those 11 jobs. Within a year, there were 40. Within 2, there were more than 150. But I promised you honesty, so here is the part of the story that is not heroic at all. As Meridian grew, that second promise grew right alongside it, the quiet, ugly one I had made to myself in the rain. Every new client, every good month, a small cold voice inside me kept a running tally against the Ashcrofts. I told myself I was building a company, and I was, but a part of me was also building a weapon, and I knew it, and I did not stop. That voice was patient. It was willing to wait years if it had to, and it was steering me, one contract at a time, toward a room I could not yet see, and a choice I was not yet ready to make. I did not begin this story as the man who would eventually make that choice. I had to become him, and there were long stretches where I very nearly became someone else entirely. Now I have to tell you the other story, the one unfolding at the very same time, 30 miles away, behind those tall iron gates. Because while I was quietly building something out of nothing, the Ashcroft family was quietly losing everything, and the hand holding the match belonged to the Golden Sun. I have pieced this together since, from public records, from Elena, and from people who worked inside that company, and were only willing to talk once it was finally safe to. Richard had begun stepping back. His health was failing in ways the family hid from nearly everyone, and he had handed more and more control to Preston, the heir, the sure thing. But Preston was not a builder. Preston was a spender, and to hide the fact that every project his father handed him kept losing money, he began doing what desperate men with access to money always do. He borrowed against the company, and then he borrowed more to cover that. I have thought about Preston for a long time, and I have arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. Preston was not lazy. Preston was terrified. He had been told his entire life that he was the heir, the sure thing, the crown of the family, and somewhere deep down he knew he had never earned a single piece of it. So when his projects began to fail, he could not admit it, because admitting it would mean admitting he was exactly the ordinary man he had spent his whole life pretending not to be. So he doubled down. He poured good money after bad into Riverside. He covered each month's losses with next month's borrowed money, and every month the hole grew deeper, and every month the smile at the charity gala grew a little more strained. The Ashcroft Group, a billion-dollar name, was quietly drowning in debt that a proud, sick old man could not bring himself to admit, and that his frightened son could not bring himself to fix. And then Preston did the thing that turned a business disaster into something far more dangerous. To secure financing his father had never approved, he forged Richard's signature on loan documents. He used the family name, his father's name, to borrow money against an empire that was no longer his to pledge. That is not bad business. That is fraud, the kind that ends with people in handcuffs and a family name dragged across the front page of every newspaper in the country. And when the numbers finally grew impossible to hide, Preston needed someone to blame. So he found a long-time, loyal executive named Harold, a man who had given the company 30 years of his life, and he quietly fed Harold to the board. Harold was walked out of the building he had helped build, in front of everyone, carrying his things in a cardboard box, ruined and bewildered, for mistakes that were entirely Preston's. Remember Harold, he matters later. Now I have to give you the false leads, the wrong turns, because at the time, not one of us understood who was truly steering that ship onto the rocks, and I was as blind as anyone. There were 3 things I believed during those years, and I was wrong about every single one of them. The first thing I believed was that Richard Ashcroft hated me. For 9 years I read his silence as pure contempt, and I built entire speeches in my head for the day I would finally prove him wrong. The second thing I believed was that Elena had no relationship left with her family after that Thanksgiving. She had walked out. She barely spoke to Preston, and yet, quietly, without ever telling me, Elena had kept one single line open, to her father, late-night phone calls I knew nothing about. When I first discovered that, something cold moved through me. I wondered, God forgive me, whether my own wife was playing both sides. Hold on to that suspicion, because it matters, and because it is completely wrong, and the day I learned how wrong it was, it broke my heart in a way I was not prepared for. The third thing I believed was that I had time. I believed this would be a slow, satisfying climb, that Meridian would grow for years before our 2 worlds ever touched again, that one day, from a nicer house, I would simply send the Ashcrofts a holiday card and feel quietly avenged. I believed I had time. I did not have time, because one ordinary morning, my head of business development walked into my office, set a folder on my desk, and said 8 words that stopped my heart cold. She said, "Daniel, the Ashcroft Group wants to talk to us." The company that had called me a failure, the family that had bet, on my own wedding day, on my downfall. They were reaching out to Meridian, the company they did not know I owned, because they needed us to survive. Their old delivery system had collapsed under the weight of Preston's mismanagement. They were hemorrhaging clients, and the one logistics operation everyone in the industry was quietly talking about, the one that could stop the bleeding, was mine. They had no idea. To them, Meridian was simply a sharp new company, run by some impressive young executive they had heard about. Why would they connect that name to me? In their minds, I was still the failure at the end of the table, the temporary problem that had somehow refused to be solved. I stood alone in my office, holding that folder, staring at the Ashcroft crest embossed on the cover, and my hands would not stop shaking. By that point, Meridian was no longer a scrappy startup. We were handling logistics for some of the largest home goods retailers in the country. Investors were calling. My name had begun appearing in the very trade publications the Ashcrofts read over breakfast. And here is the strangest part of all. I was still bracing, every single day, for the moment it would all be taken away from me. That fear never fully leaves a person who grew up with nothing. You can build an empire and still sleep like a man, expecting an eviction notice under the door. For 9 years, the Ashcrofts had owned a story about me, and I had quietly let that story become my own, the failure. And the only thing I had ever actually done, the only real thing, was refuse to stop working on the days when quitting would have been the reasonable choice. That is the whole secret. The world does not reward the most gifted person in the room. It rewards the one still standing when everyone else has finally sat down. And I was, somehow, still standing. 3 days before the Ashcroft Group was scheduled to sit across from me and beg for help, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go. I was tired, and I did not have it in me for another stranger that night, but I answered. And the voice on the other end belonged to Richard Ashcroft, the old man himself, the father who had spoken perhaps 40 words to me across 9 years. He said, "Is this Daniel? Elena's Daniel?" And when I said yes, there was a long pause, and in that pause I heard something I had never once heard from Richard Ashcroft. I heard him struggling to find the words. This was a man who could command a room with a single glance, and he was nervous to speak to me. And then he said the thing that made the floor tilt beneath my feet. He said, "I have been watching your company for a year now. I know that it is yours. I have known for a long time. I have a folder on my desk about Meridian Logistics thick as a phone book, and I have read every page of it more than once. And I need you to listen to me very carefully, because I do not have much time, and there is something about my son, about Preston, that you have to hear before you walk into that room and destroy us all. Because I promise you, Daniel, you would have every right to." I could not speak. 9 years of silence from this man, and now a flood I was not prepared for. And then, before he told me about the loans, before he told me about the decision, he told me the first true thing. He told me he was dying. Pancreatic cancer. Months, not years. The family knew he was unwell, but they did not know it was the end, because he had hidden the worst of it even from Elena. Because, in his words, a dying king only makes the wolves circle faster. And then he told me about Preston. Not merely the mismanagement, not merely the debt. He told me about the forged signatures, the loans taken out against his own name that he had never approved, the fraud that could end with his son in a prison cell, and the family name destroyed in every newspaper in the country. He had discovered it 6 months earlier, and he was trapped. Expose his own child, and the scandal would collapse everything he had spent his life building. Do nothing, and the debt would collapse it anyway. He was a dying man watching his life's work set on fire by the one child he had chosen to trust. And then he asked me a question that made no sense to me yet. He asked, "Do you remember that Thanksgiving, when Preston stood up and humiliated you in front of everyone, and Elena defended you, and I said nothing at all?" I said yes. Of course I remembered. I had built my entire life around that night. And Richard said, "That was the night I knew." Not that night in spite of what happened. Because of it, I sat at the head of my own table, and I watched my son tear down an honest man for the crime of not being born into money, and I watched no one lift a finger to stop him except my daughter. And I went upstairs that night, Daniel, and I could not sleep, because I finally understood that I had spent my entire life measuring the wrong things in the wrong people. He said, I had bet everything on the child who knew how to spend, and I had ignored the man who knew how to build. I was too proud to ever say it to your face. I am a coward in that particular way. But I was not too proud to do something about it. And then he told me what he had done. The very morning after that Thanksgiving, Richard Ashcroft had quietly gone to his lawyers, and without telling his wife, without telling his son, without telling even Elena, he had begun moving his controlling shares of the Ashcroft Group into a private trust, a trust with a single beneficiary, one who would gain full control of the company the moment it ever entered true financial crisis. That beneficiary was not Preston. It was not Margaret. It was not divided among the children. It was Elena, my wife, the daughter they kept on a junior clerk's salary to build character, the woman who returned a broken coffee maker and married a man from above a laundromat. For 2 years, unknown to nearly everyone alive, Elena had quietly held the mechanism of control over a billion-dollar empire, set to trigger at the exact moment it began to fall. And in that instant, standing in my office with the phone pressed to my ear, everything I had misunderstood came apart and rearranged itself into the truth. The secret phone calls. Remember when I told you that I found out Elena had been quietly speaking to her father, and for one cold moment I wondered whose side she was truly on. This was what those calls were. She had not been betraying me. She had been trying, over and over, for 2 years, to convince her dying father to act, to stop Preston before it was too late. She had never told me, because Richard had made her swear not to, because he was ashamed, because he wanted to fix it himself, and by the time he finally admitted that he could not, he had almost no time left. Every one of those late-night calls I had quietly feared was my wife on a dark porch, begging her father to save his family from itself. I had suspected the woman who believed in me when no one else on earth did, and I have never fully forgiven myself for that. Richard kept talking, his voice growing weaker, and he said the thing that put me on the floor of my own office. He said, I watched you build something real, in the dark, with nothing, while my son burned something real to the ground in broad daylight with everything handed to him. You could always build, Daniel. I simply could not see it, because you did not come with a name I recognized. I realized, standing there, that I was crying, and not because he was praising me. It was because for 9 years I had carried this man's contempt like a stone in my chest, and it turned out the stone had never been contempt at all. It had been a proud, dying father who had known the truth for years and been too ashamed to speak it. That is a different kind of weight entirely. And somehow it was so much harder to set down. The crisis Richard had predicted arrived exactly on schedule. The forged loans came due. The company could not pay. And under the quiet terms of that trust, written the morning after my humiliation, control of the Ashcroft Group passed to Elena, to us. On paper, quietly, legally, the empire that had spent 9 years treating me like the help already belonged to the failure and the woman who had always believed in him. All that remained was the meeting, the room, the moment they would finally learn who they had been begging to save them. And so we come back, at last, to where this story began. The Ashcroft family walked into that boardroom, expecting to shake hands with the impressive young stranger who would rescue them. They filed in one by one, Margaret in her pearls, Camille pale and quiet, Preston loosening his tie as though the room had run out of air, and Richard, frail now, thin, in a wheelchair, watching everything. The doors at the far end of that long room opened, and I walked in, and I watched the understanding move across their faces one at a time, like a light being switched on in room after room of a darkened house. The failure, the charity case, the temporary problem, standing at the head of their table, holding the pen, holding their entire future inside a single folder. Margaret was the first to understand. She had walked into that room prepared to be gracious to the promising young stranger who would save her family, and I watched her rehearsed smile arrive on her face and then die there, muscle by muscle, as she recognized me. The woman who had once had a folding chair carried out of the garage, rather than set a place for me at Christmas, went perfectly, completely white. And for the first time in 9 years, Margaret Ashcroft had absolutely nothing to say. Camille made a small sound, half a gasp, and pressed her hand to her mouth, and in her eyes I saw something I had not expected. Not fear, shame. 9 years of silence, of watching and saying nothing, landing on her all at once. And Preston stood up. I think it was pure instinct, the body of a man who had spent his whole life being the most important person in every room he entered. He opened his mouth, and I watched him realize there was nothing left to say, because the numbers were the numbers. The forged loans were the forged loans, and the man he had called a failure at that dinner table was now the only thing standing between him and a prison cell. He lowered himself slowly back into his chair, as if his legs had stopped believing in him. And the strangest thing happened to me in that silence. I had waited 9 years for this exact moment. I had built an entire company to reach it. I had rehearsed the speech 1,000 times, and now that it was finally here, now that I had every one of them precisely where I had dreamed of having them, I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired, and underneath the tired, I felt the weight of a dying man's voice, sitting in my chest like a stone I could not put down. Because 3 days earlier, at the very end of that phone call, Richard Ashcroft had asked me for one thing, and I have to tell you what it was, because it is the reason I did not become the man they had always insisted I was. He said, "You will have every right to destroy them, and if you do, no honest person alive would blame you. But I am asking you, not as an Ashcroft, not as a rich man, but as a father who got everything wrong, to protect my family from the worst version of themselves. Preston is weak, not evil. Margaret is frightened, not cruel. She simply learned a long time ago to hide her fear behind money. Save them, if you can do it without losing yourself. Because the moment you become cruel to prove that you are strong, they win. They turn you into the failure they always said you were. Do not let them. Be the man I was too blind to see." And so, in that room, with every eye on me, I opened the folder. Inside was not a lawsuit. It was not a press release, exposing Preston's fraud to the world. It was not a demand for their homes, their cars, their name. It was a contract, a rescue and restructuring agreement. Meridian would absorb the Ashcroft Group's crushing debt, fold its broken operations into our own, and keep the company alive, under one condition: the forged loans. The crime that could have sent Preston to prison and turned the Ashcroft name into a punchline, I made quietly disappear. I had the leverage and the capital to settle them privately, to bury them, to make them simply cease to exist. No scandal, no handcuffs, no headline. I slid a single sheet of paper down the length of that long table, and it came to rest in front of Preston. I looked at him, and I said the only thing I had rehearsed. I told him, "You once said a temporary problem gets solved. You were right, so I am solving it. Not the way you meant. The debt is gone. The company survives. Your name stays clean. And in exchange, you are going to come and work at Meridian. Not in a corner office. On the warehouse floor. You are going to learn what it actually takes to build something, from the bottom, the way I had to. And if you cannot do it, you will leave with your name and nothing else. That is the deal." I know that some of you, hearing this, are angry with me. I understand. Part of me wanted the fire too. That was the second promise I had made in the rain, the ugly one. But a dying man had asked me for something, and I found I could not refuse it. Richard Ashcroft died 4 days after that phone call. He never made it into that boardroom. The version of events I have told you is memory, and memory does not always keep its scenes in order. The last time I saw him alive was at a small family gathering 3 days before he passed, and from his wheelchair, across the room, he looked at me and gave me a single nod. Just one. It was the only nod he ever gave me, and I have built the rest of my life on it. After the funeral, a lawyer handed me a plain white envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, in Richard's own hand, the letters shaky at the very end. 4 words. "Fix what I couldn't," signed, with his initials. I need you to understand why those 4 words nearly put me on the floor. Because 30 years earlier, a different man had left a different note for a different boy. My father, when he walked out on us, left an old toolbox and a note that said, "Fix what you can." That note had shaped my entire life. I became a man who fixes things, because a man who abandoned me told me to. And now a second father, the one who had ignored me for 9 years, the one I had been fully prepared to hate until the day I died, had left me almost the very same instruction, from the other side of it. Fix what I couldn't. 2 fathers, 2 notes, one asking me to fix what I could, and one finally admitting there were things he never could. I keep both of those notes in that old toolbox now, and the toolbox sits in the corner of an office most people will never be allowed to enter. There are 2 more things I have to tell you, because I promised you the loose threads, and I keep my promises. The first is Camille. After that meeting, she followed me into the hallway, her eyes red, and she said the one thing no one else in that family ever managed to say. She said, "I watched them do it to you for 9 years, and I never once opened my mouth." I told myself it was not my place. But silence is a choice, Daniel, and I made the wrong one, over and over, and I am sorry. I told her the truth, that her silence had hurt more than Preston's words, because I had always expected cruelty from Preston, but I had quietly hoped for better from her. And then I gave her a job, a real one, because people who can finally admit they were wrong are exactly the people worth betting on. The second thread is Harold. You remember Harold, the loyal executive Preston fed to the wolves to cover his own failures. The man walked out of the building in front of everyone for a crime he did not commit. The very first phone call I made after taking control of the Ashcroft Group was to Harold. I offered him his job back, his title back, and his dignity back, with an apology on behalf of a company that had wronged him. A 62-year-old man wept on the phone. He sits on our board now, and every time I see him across a table, I remember what winning is actually for. Not for revenge, for this. And Elena, at her father's graveside in the rain, took my hand and whispered, "He knew. At the end he knew he had been wrong, and most people never get that. You gave him that." I told her I had given him nothing, and she said, "You let him fix it." That is the kindest thing I have ever seen anyone do. It has been 3 years now. Preston still works at Meridian. It took him 18 brutal months to stop being who he was, but the man who packs freight on the East Dock today is someone his father would have been proud of. In the beginning, he was furious, humiliated, certain I had built the whole arrangement only to torture him, and maybe, if I am honest, a small part of me had. But something happens to a person when they finally do real work with their own hands, when they finally earn a thing instead of inheriting it. Around the 12th month, a supervisor told me Preston had stayed 4 hours late, unpaid, to help a frightened new hire learn the routing system. He did not know I would ever hear about it. That was the first time I believed his father had been right. That weakness, unlike cruelty, can sometimes be healed. Last Thanksgiving, at a much quieter table than the one where this all began, Preston stood up to make a toast. And when he said my name this time, there was no knife hidden inside it. He simply said, "To Daniel, who saved us, even though we did not deserve it." And I told him he was wrong about one thing. I said, "You did deserve it. Everyone deserves the chance to become someone better than they were." That is the whole point. Margaret was at that table too, older now, quieter, softer around the edges, a woman who had once seated me by the kitchen door and now passed me the bread without a word of ceremony. And at the head of the table, where Richard used to sit, were Elena and I. Not because we seized it, because a dying man, in the quiet, decided we belonged there long before anyone else could see it. I have thought a great deal about those 9 years, and about what they were truly trying to teach me, and I want to leave you with what I finally learned, in case you need it the way I did. For nearly a decade, a powerful family told me exactly who I was. A failure, a temporary problem. And the strange, quiet truth I discovered is this: the people who are the most certain that you will amount to nothing are almost always the people most terrified that they themselves will. Preston needed me to be a failure because he was so afraid of being one. Margaret needed me beneath her because she had built her entire identity on being above someone. None of it was ever really about me. It never is. Cruelty, I have come to believe, is simply fear wearing a more expensive suit. I could have destroyed them. I had every legal right and every emotional reason in the world. And if I had, I would have proven them right. I would have become just one more man who mistook cruelty for strength. Instead, I fixed what I could, and I let a dying man's 4 words fix what he could not. And I want to say one thing directly to whoever needed to hear this today, because I know some of you are not watching this for the drama. I know some of you are living your own version of it right now. Maybe there is a family that decided who you were a long time ago and never once updated the file. Maybe there is a voice you still hear in the mirror on your worst mornings, telling you that you will never be anything. Maybe, like me, you have started to believe it, because they said it kindly enough, and often enough. So here is what 9 years and a billion-dollar company taught me, and I offer it to you for free. The day you stop accepting other people's fear as the truth about your own worth is the day the real building begins. I did not beat the Ashcrofts by becoming crueler than they were. I beat them by refusing to, living well, building something real, and staying kind on the day you finally have the power to be otherwise. That is not weakness. It is the hardest and the rarest kind of strength there is, and it is the only revenge that does not cost you your soul on the way to getting it. The old man understood that, in the end, in 4 shaking words: fix what you can, and when you cannot fix all of it, at the very least, refuse to become the thing that broke you. So now I want to hear from you, because I still do not have complete peace about it. Tell me honestly, was I a fool? If it had been you, seated at the head of that table, holding the pen, with the family that humiliated you for 9 years waiting to learn their fate, would you have done what I did, or would you have burned it all to the ground? There is no wrong answer, and I go back and forth on it myself. And here is a harder question. Who do you think the real villain of this story was? Was it Preston, who said the cruel thing out loud? Was it Margaret, with her polite little knives? Or was it every person at that table who watched a good man be torn down for 9 years and chose to say nothing at all? I have my answer. I would like to hear yours. If this story moved you, if you have ever been underestimated, written off, or told you would never be anything by the very people who were supposed to love you, then do me one small favor. Leave a comment with a single word, the word someone once used to make you feel small. Let us fill the comments with those words, and then let us bury them together, right there, out in the open. Because the truth is, not one of us was ever the thing they said we were. We were only the person still standing when they finally sat down. My name is Daniel. They called me a failure, and the sweetest revenge I ever found, in the end, was refusing to become one.